Hi, this is Beth Billings with Around the Table Yarns, and today we're going to work on knitting and purling backwards. Knitting and purling backwards is a technique where you work across the row and then without turning, you work back across the row. It's very useful if you're doing short rows, if you're doing entrelac, if you're doing a small piece of knitting. I can think of things like the potato chip scarf where you have short rows that are like 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it can be a very handy way to work short amounts of knitting back and forth. I did this sample and I was practicing doing stockinette back and forth without turning the rows. And then I thought it made my knitting gauge seem a little bit tighter. So I did a similar number of rows and stitches in the traditional way of knitting across and purling back. And I'm really quite clear that this is much looser gauge than when I did it without turning. So just like any knitting technique that's new to you, this is something that you should practice before you do it in a project. If you do it in a project, you probably shouldn't go back and forth between turning and doing the knitting backwards or the purling backwards, because it may cause disruptions in your gauge. So I just wanted to point that out before I got started. The other thing you should know is that you have to be able to work off of both ends. So double pointed needles, either 6 or 8 inch, are a good tool to use to do this. So I have just purled across this row to create a difference in my, just to give us a visual difference so that we can see this work. And now I'm going to go ahead and work across it backwards. So I'm going to hold the yarn in my right hand because that's where I normally hold the yarn. And just like you identify, so a knitting stitch is like a horseshoe, and it is typically on the needle with the right leg of the stitch closest to you and the left leg of the stitch furthest away. So we think of this as the back leg of the stitch, and this is the front leg of the stitch. When we knit backwards, we're essentially doing the purl row, but from left to right, and transferring the stitches from the right needle back to the left needle. So I'm going to go into the stitch and I'm going to put my left needle into the back of the stitch. So it's going in the opposite direction from my right needle. And I'm going to wrap the yarn around the needle counterclockwise. So I'm not going to go this way around the needle. I'm going to go this way around the needle. And I'm going to hold it somewhat firmly with my left hand as I bring it through. Then I have to push to the left and that stitch comes off. So let's do that again. I go into the back leg of the stitch. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit so you can see it more clearly. I'm going to go into the back leg of the stitch. I'm going to go counterclockwise around the stitch and come off. Back leg, counterclockwise and off. All the way across. And that's the trouble I have with it, is I kind of fumble a little bit. You need to keep a fairly regular tension. Sometimes I use my index finger of my left hand to help me make that stitch. I looked at the videos for this, and A New Stitch a Day has a video for how to do knitting and purling backwards, and Very Pink Knits also has one. So those are other videos you can watch for more information. And then I was looking in Carol Radcliffe's book about color knitting, sorry, Margaret Radcliffe's book about color knitting, and had more information. There's a little bit more information there. So again, this is a technique that's really helpful if you have short numbers of stitches to work back and forth, especially if you have a large piece of knitting. People frequently use this for entrelac because you might be making an entrelac style blanket. And you'll only have like this much knitting to do, but the whole blanket has to be turned back and forth. So let's go back across, and you can see the technique again. So I'm just going to go back across these stitches. I'm trying to keep my tension as even as possible. And then I get to here, and I'm going to go back into this back leg of the stitch, wrap the wrong way around, and then slide it off to the left. I like to bring, I kind of use, I apologize. Let's make it not quite so zoomed in. When I go in, I like to bring my needle, I like to sort of stretch this stitch out by bringing the right needle towards me and then going over the stitch to be able to bring the new stitch through. So I go in and out. I kind of pull the needle away from the right needle away from the left needle and jump over that stitch. Now you can see the stitch just on the inside, and I keep the tip of the left needle touching the right needle to complete it. So I jump over, keep the tip touching, and that helps me be a little bit more secure. And I'm using my other fingers to help finish that up. So as I was practicing this, I noticed that all of the videos and all of the instructions in books that I looked up showed you how to knit backwards, but none of them showed you how to purl backwards. So what if you're doing garter stitch? What if you're doing knitting and purling in the row? What happens then? So I challenged myself to try and do it, and I found the way. So there we go. There's 2 rows, and maybe I've loosened up a little bit. Maybe I was just tight at my cast on, but I'm pretty sure that it affects my gauge. Okay, so now let's say we're going to purl a row. So we're going in and we're bringing the top of that old stitch forward for the purl stitch. There shouldn't be any reason why we couldn't purl backwards as well as knit backwards. So what do we need to do to make that happen? It turns out it's the same leg involved that we knit into, just like it's the same leg involved that we purl into. So when I first tried it, I was doing this and going backwards, and I ended up with a row of twisted stitches. So the secret is to use the back leg, because it's the front leg when we're knitting or purling that we would go into. So you wouldn't go into this stitch unless you wanted to twist the stitches. So I'm going to go into the back leg purlwise. I'm going to go counterclockwise around and bring it backwards and off. So purlwise into that back stitch and off. Purlwise and around and off. Purlwise. So I'm going into the stitch from in between the stitch and the next one, and then coming forward towards me, towards the front of the work. And then I'm going counterclockwise around it with the yarn. Everything is going backwards. So you can see it looks just like if I were knitting back. All right. So now we've gotten to the end of the row. And it looks just like if we'd done it. No stitches or twist. No stitches were twisted in the making of this video. So the other challenge would be if you wanted to knit and purl, if you were doing ribbing. So let's say we had purl 2 or purl 4, knit 4. The only difference between these stitches and what we've done previously is moving the yarn between the needles. So obviously that's going to be the same issue that we're going to have going backwards. So again, I'm going to start with my knit stitch. So I'm going to go into the back of that stitch, staying on that side, staying on the back side of my right needle, go anti-clockwise around or counterclockwise around and bring that stitch off. Repeat that for the 3 knit stitches. And then bring the yarn forward. Go into the next stitch, into the back leg of that next stitch, backwards purlwise. Again, it's a counterclockwise wrap. So the wrap is backwards to what we normally, oh, you know what? The wrap isn't backwards to what we normally do. Wrap is the same as what we normally do because we normally go out and around. So we're normally going counterclockwise. It's the same wrap. Okay, and then move the yarn between the needles again to stay in the pattern. And then we're going to move them back and we're going to purl the last 4. The dog is trying to get my attention. Okay. So there we have it. You can knit backwards, you can purl backwards, and you can do ribbing backwards. And it will look just the same as if you turned your work. So next time you're doing short rows for a project or doing entrelac, this is an option that you can use. Thank you.